and I'm the Director of Education and Community Engagement here at the Tennessee State Museum. And it's always exciting to just kind of take a break during the work week and talk some Tennessee history, gather up digitally at least, and share and connect through Tennessee history. So we've got a great episode lined up for you today. This person is really in one of the quintessential Tennessee historians of our generation, and I'm so thankful to have the opportunity to have him on Lunch with a Curator. Many of you, I'm sure all of you know Mr. Jim Hoobler. He's the Senior Curator of Art and Architecture. He's going to bring us a tour of the People's Building and the history of the Tennessee State Capitol. And so this is going to be a fun hour that we're going to have together as we sort of take a deep dive into the history of this National Historic Landmark. And there's no better person really on the planet to do that than Jim Hoobler. So I'm excited to have him. Before we get started, though, we got to go through those all-important housekeeping tips. First of all is the mute button. Everyone should be muted, but if you're not, just make sure, if you're unsure, just make sure your microphone there at the bottom left of your screen is red, and you should be muted and everything. We should not be able to hear anything from your end, and so that should be one easy way to stay muted. Secondly, the chat feature. We do want you to ask questions to Jim today. About the Capitol, anything you'd like to know, just press the chat feature. It is the text bubble there at the bottom of your screen, and you can click on it, and it'll bring up that chat box. And if you click all participants or all panelists, that will allow all of us, the panelists, to see your questions, and then I will refer those questions to Jim at the end of today's talk. Lastly, if you have any problems, Rachel Helvering is here as the tech person to help with any sort of tech support you need. She's our community engagement manager, and she can help you. Just type your question or comment into the chat box, send it her way, and she can help you there. Okay, all right, I think that's good, and I think now we'll introduce our speaker. As I said, Jim has been a personal mentor of mine for all of my career at the Tennessee State Museum. And later this month, he will be retiring from the State Museum. So it has been just a magnificent career. He has contributed so much to all of our collective understanding of not just the state capitol, but Nashville history, Tennessee art. It's an honor and pleasure to have him on our episode today to speak on the People's House, the Tennessee State Capitol. Jim, welcome to Lunch with a Curator, and thanks for joining us. Are you ready?
I am.
All right, it's all yours. Take it away.
Okay. Well, let's back up to sort of how Nashville got. In 1843, Lean Jimmy Jones became governor of Tennessee, and there was a clause in the 1834 Constitution that said the legislature had until that year to pick a permanent seat of government for Tennessee. So he charged the legislature with doing the mission they'd been given 9 years earlier, and Nashville was ultimately selected since it was essentially in the middle of the state and fairly easy to get to by water. The next step was to find an architect. They did a national search. They selected William Strickland of Philadelphia, and he came to Nashville, and they selected the top of what was then Campbell's Hill as the location for the Capitol. They contacted one of our state Supreme Court justices, George Washington Campbell, whose house was at the top of the hill, and Mayor Powhatan Maxey negotiated with him for its purchase as an inducement for the selection of Nashville as the permanent capital. And it all worked out. In fact, those two men are in close proximity today out at City Cemetery. Well, on the 4th of July, 1845, they laid the cornerstone to the Capitol building. And it was a long process. It took about 14 years to build the building. largely because technology had hardly improved from the day of Pericles building ancient Athens. They were still using wooden scaffolding. They were still using iron tools to quarry the stone out of the rock quarries. They were still dragging it into place and lifting it with a wooden crane, much like they built the Parthenon several thousand years earlier. And we do have a drawing that William Strickland did. It's an interesting piece. I think that'll be our first image. It's over in the collection of the Tennessee State Library and Archives. And it shows a Capitol that's not entirely like the one we're used to seeing. If you notice in the drawing here, it's almost like a wedding cake. There are three levels. There's a wall around the bottom with columns holding it up. There is a promenade or a deck at that level, like the surrounding spaces that are at the Capitol today. Another row of taller columns, and then a very squat and thick version of the Karadzic Monument in Athens at the top. Fortunately, he streamlined it a bit, and that is not the building we got. Let's look at the next image. While they were building the Capitol, it did take 14 years, but ultimately by 1880, Nashville was celebrating its centennial, and the Tennessee Historical Society bought the last remaining casting by Clark Mills of the first equestrian statue ever made in America of General Andrew Jackson victorious at the Battle of New Orleans on horseback. And you can see it there in the right, draped, awaiting its unveiling. The crowd estimate was 30,000 people that day. We didn't have OSHA in that period, so look at the building. They're on top of the roof, they're on the terraces, they're on the porticos, they're on the small balustrades almost, or those ledges around the building. And fortunately, no one was hurt that day. Moving along, the next image is going to move into the front lawn of the Capitol. You can see it was still in a residential neighborhood in that day. This is one of the Otto Gears photographs showing the newly installed Jackson statue. And there to the right, you can see one of the original basins to the water fountains around the Capitol. Okay. Next one shows the executive floor of the Capitol building. You can see the original gasolier, and it's from these photographs that a friend of mine had in her attic that we were able back in the 1980s to see the original detailing of some of the frescoing on the ceiling, to see the gasoliers that had been destroyed in the 1930s that were originally up there. And if you look closely, you can see there is a spittoon in the middle of the floor there. We'll get into that with the next image. There was a line of them that lined the entire hallway from entrance to entrance, from the north to the south of the building. You can see another one of those beautiful gasoliers hanging there in the hall. And a sign, which is hard to read here, but is a little bit more evident in some of the other photographs, that said, "Do not spit on the floor or the steps." In 1975, Theresa Yelverton was visiting from Britain, and she mentioned how slippery the floors were in Tennessee because people weren't always aiming for those spittoons. Let's go to the next one. Upstairs, in a building that had essentially a Roman heating system eventually, or originally, I should say, big fires in the basement, you lay flues in the floor. Where does hot air go? It goes up. Hopefully you get a little downstairs. But in a space with a 42-foot ceiling, they did not want to meet up there in the winter. So they met every other year with the General Assembly in the fall when it was still fairly warm. But notice they have airlocks on the door to try and maintain whatever little heat they could capture in the room. Also in the days before air conditioning, when you opened every window and every door and prayed for a breeze, notice the stabilization chains attached to the top of that gasolier so that it did not swing wildly in the wind on a hot summer day. All right. In the next Gears image, we see the original gasolier. And these are wonderful images. I knew that they were out there in my friend Sarah Green's collection, and they're the only images I've ever seen of the actual original gas light in the Capitol. You can also see the original oak desks that were made over in Knoxville that were the original pieces in the room, and the marble lecterns, which survived there until the 1950s when they destroyed them to build larger wooden ones for the new electronic apparatuses they were using. Go to the next one and you'll see another detail of the gasolier. Look between the two tiers of large lights and you'll see, maybe, I hope, Native Americans and corn plants, because Native Americans, of course, until the Indian Removal Act, were part of Tennessee's history. Hopefully, we all recognize that we still have Native Americans in Tennessee. Also, there were corn plants on that level. On the upper tier above that row of lights, you'll see buffalo. They were a native animal in the state. There were herds of buffalo right here in Nashville. And above the buffalo, you will notice that there are tobacco plants that are blossoming. And above that, wrapped around the gas tube, there are American eagles. Corn, cotton, and tobacco were the three chief cash crops. So on the branches or arms to the gasolier, there were also cotton blossoms. Okay. The next image is of some of the salvaged pieces. Unfortunately, in the mid-1880s, the Shelby County delegation got nervous sitting under that large blunt object, and they got the rest of the legislature to go with that brand new technology, raw wires with light bulbs hanging from it, and they removed the gasolier, they hacked it to bits, and carried off personal trophies. Over the years, we've been given a number of buffaloes, Indians, a corn stalk with the ears of corn on it, and some tobacco plants. But with the Gears photographs, it could be replaced and reproduced. Next image is also a historic image of the library chamber, which was the last room completed in the building. Notice that the Tennessee Historical Society has all of their treasures of artifacts in there, and they've so outgrown the space, they're even blocking a doorway there with a cabinet full of prehistoric Native American objects. They have paintings propped up on the bookshelf. There are books everywhere. There's a little research table there on the right. And notice the profile of the back of that chair. It absolutely matched a chair in the museum collection that was a gift to Samuel Dold Morgan by his workers at his furniture factory in North Georgia. So when we were working on the restoration of the building, we had those reproduced as the seating in that room. Also notice just barely in the bottom right corner, there is a potbelly stove with a poker set there to try and add some heat to that stone room on a cold winter's day. But my favorite part of the image is that spiral staircase. It was made by the Wooden Prot Company of Philadelphia. All of the ironwork in the building was made by them. And notice the modesty panels that are hanging from the inside of the railing. So as the lady librarian might be going upstairs, that gentleman to our right could not cop a peek of her ankles. Next image is upstairs in the library. And you can see they're trying to maximize space, so they've unframed a lot of their portraits and they're hanging stretcher to stretcher with paper labels with hand-lettered identifications who the portrait subjects are. There's a line of military flags and political banners hanging up there. And unfortunately, because they did that, they deteriorated and they're no longer in the collection. They're simply gone. Okay, these are all Gears photographs, by the way. This is a photograph that was made right around the turn of the century of the State Treasurer's Office. And several things are of interest in this. Number one, there is not a wall dividing that space as there is today. It's one room that goes from the hall to the exterior wall. And look at the electric lights they've installed in there in 1904. Again, it's a raw light bulb with a little glass dish on top of it. Okay. The next image is another view of one of those rooms. It's a little bit earlier. It still has one of the original gas lights in it, but it's been modified into an electric light. Notice on the right, there's a fireplace in there for some heat in the room, and there's some later Victorian stenciling on the ceiling at that point. Okay. The next image is of the House chamber. And if you notice, the members are sitting all around the speaker's well up there at the front, near My God to Thee. And at the back, there is a visitor's rail, which is interesting because today We don't comply with ADA necessarily because if you're in a wheelchair or on crutches, there is a very long flight of steps, no elevators, to the visitors gallery. But originally in the House chamber, there was a provision for people with mobility issues, and you could go into the room there about 6 feet in. Also, there were no fireplaces in the Capitol House chamber. The only fireplaces off of that room were at the far ends of the room, at the extreme ends of the visitors gallery, so that they could connect with a solid wall and be vented outside. Okay. Originally, the building was heated with what they called, the Romans would have called a hypocaustic system. You have large fires going in the basement. The basement was divided into two spaces. You can see the portico here in the middle of the photograph. And essentially, there was just a tunnel connecting north and south ends of the building originally. Because at one end, you have large fires going so that the heat can go up and heat the spaces upstairs. On the other end, you had the state armaments of the militia. So there's gunpowder and weapons down there. And you know, fire and gunpowder don't necessarily move. So they had separated those. But the building would have been rather chilly initially. The next step, of course, after installing pot-bellied stoves is you go to steam heat. Notice on the slope of the hill there, about halfway down between the driveway and the straight street line down there, there is a retention pond and a steam plant on the north slope of the hill, going from it to the Capitol to bring in the steam heated water into the radiators of the building. And that was the step before we had our forced air systems that we use today. Let's go to the next image. This is one of the photographs that my friend Charlie Waterfield shot. When Charlie graduated from Yale Architecture School in the 1950s, he was a lucky guy. One of his first jobs was to work on the stabilization and restoration of the Capitol building. These original cast iron figures were a pair on each one of the steps leading up to the Capitol. They represented morning, noon, and night. And the state architect decided, well, since they were broken, and since they're so old and so old-fashioned, he would throw them away. So they were taken and disposed of. He told me personally out at Ellington Agricultural Center, put in a landfill and crushed. But one of the figures survives, and I know where she is. Let's go to the next one. This is why they had to do the major work on the Capitol in the 1950s. It was badly deteriorating. Strickland had used the beautifully veined Nashville limestone as his building material, but unfortunately it's not commercial grade. So it was sparling, flaking, large pieces were falling off. In the 1950s, it was decided that they would remove every column from the building, every pediment, segments of the exterior wall, all of the terraces, and the pilasters up in the tower, and replace them with the limestone from Indiana. Now, if you're up at the Capitol early morning or late afternoon with the low raking light, you'll notice a definite color differential. The Indiana limestone is more of a brownish cast, where ours is a whitish gray. But that's why they did that in the 1950s. Go to the next image. This is the removal of the original columns from the building. And you can see the newly carved elements that they're going to install there on the terraces to the lower right, and also the terracing that they're replacing up there on the porticos. Okay, the next image is also from this period, and it shows the replacement of some of the exterior portions of the tower on the Capitol building and the scaffolding to support that. All right, next one is the roof of the tower. And notice the LNC tower there. When it was built in the mid-1950s, it was the tallest building between Baltimore and Washington and Miami and Houston. And it's like a giant finger sticking up in Nashville, the index finger pointing upward. The ironwork there was made down at the foot of Broadway at First and Broad by the T.M. Brennan Works. They did this beautiful ornamental ironwork initially. And it still survives there. A few years ago, I was up there on the roof and I noticed that the paint was chipping badly and starting to rust the ironwork. So I went to the state architect and reported that to them, and we were able to do like in the 1950s and take all of that ironwork down, strip it and repaint it, and then put the tower back together and clean the tower. So it's good for another 100 years, we hope. Go to the next one. This is what they did in the basement of the Capitol. You can see they're introducing new wiring, new water systems, and you can see those piers, those stone piers, which are holding up all of the massive weight of the Capitol. They're evenly spaced throughout the entire basement to evenly distribute the weight. And when they determined that they were going to make what was initially called the crypt into an office space, they excavated carefully within the profile of each one of those piers down into the live rock, the actual limestone composing the hill itself, to lower the floor level and make that into a workspace. Let's go to the next image. This is what it looked like when it was new in the 1950s. Everybody in sort of the open office plan that they endorsed at that point. And you can see the windows in the basement of the building. A number of them still have iron rods on them because of the arsenal having been stored down there originally. Let's go to the next image. This is the proposal that the city of Nashville and the state came to maintain the view shed of the building, the front elevation, the east facing the river. You can see down at the bottom the municipal auditorium, which they were going to build, the Cordell Hall building, which was going up there on the right, and terraces, which are lowered to street level on 6th, 5th, and 4th Avenues, so that the street view coming in from the Gallatin Turnpike from several miles away, you could still see the facade of the Capitol as you approached Nashville. And fortunately, we're still maintaining that view shed. Let's go to the next view. This is me in the 1980s, the yellow on the right. From 78 to 88, I was the director of the Tennessee Historical Society, which is private, which meant I could lobby and did. And we had the House and Senate finance chairs, John Bragg and Douglas Henry, who loved Tennessee, loved our history. They were members of the Historical Society. So I made a report in the mid-80s on how badly the building was deteriorating, reminding all of us that it is the people's house and it should survive longer than any of us, and that the state needed to address that by restoring the building. They took that report to Governor Alexander. He created a Capital Restoration Commission, and off we went. And in this space, the 4 bays that you see there were originally Governor Alexander's press secretary's office, and he told him, "Boys, I'm moving you to the basement. I've got a telephone and a fax machine. I know where you're at." And then the remainder of that room and the actual Supreme Court offices were occupied at that point by the Secretary of State of Tennessee. And Secretary Crowell generously said, "Well, if you find me another space, I'll move." So F&A vacated some of their space across the hall and he moved over there. So this room had disappeared in the 1930s when the Supreme Court moved into their own structure. This was cut up into 6 offices. That we were amazed that they had not destroyed the original columns. They'd simply boxed them up. We dodged that bullet. And so we were able to restore that room. They had covered it up initially in the 1930s with colonial revival paneling and hung Art Deco lights in there. Let's go to the next image. This is the room as it was completed. We also found 3 gas lights from the 1850s. The extreme ends of the room are even made by the Cornelius Company of Philadelphia, who originally had the lighting contract on the building. Go to the next. This is the governor's reception room as it looked when we finished the restoration. We put period carpeting in all of the offices on that floor. We bought some antique accent pieces of furniture to give it a flavor of what it would have looked like when it was new. But we determined we were not going to remove the Georgian Revival woodwork. It's part of the history now. And the WPA era murals, which are also a testament to Tennessee history. And they've been in there about 90 years at this point. Let's go to the next one. And when we finished the restoration in '86, Lamar was having his homecoming '86, and we had a big celebration in Nashville at that point. Now, the next images we're going to see are about the renovation of the building that we did a second time. Back in the 1980s, when we worked on the restoration of the building, that's the first time I know of that the entire building was evacuated. Everyone and everything was taken out of it. We poulticed all of the walls on the executive floor, pulling about 150 years of tar and nicotine and body lipids from human touches on the wall. And we did that again in 2012, because what happened between the 1980s and 2012 with computering and the need for wiring? So we had to put more paneling in the floors, and we did another cleaning. Here's the library going through a cleaning in 2012. I have a question here. What are lipids? They're body oils from the touch of human hands or your hair. So for example, out in the hallway, you'll see grease rings on the wall where somebody's head is leaned up against it and some of the oils from their hair have become embedded in the stonework. Probably we need to clean it again. Let's go to the next one. The library is my favorite room in the building. All of this beautiful wooden Perrott ironwork up there. There was an interesting story that someone invented, which wasn't true, that those beautiful cameos up there, Tennessee wanted some extra ones made. So we had commissioned some extra Tennessee faces up there. We had Hugh Lawson White, we had Felix Grundy, we had the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and we had a number of people that we thought, like Felix Grundy, should be added to it, and Hugh Lawson White and John Bell. We also had Andrew Jackson and James K. Polk. Well, I had done a book with Miles Lane on antebellum architecture in the South. So when we finished that, he told me I could use his townhouse in Savannah. And I knew that the Historic Savannah Foundation had, when they demolished the Wetter House in Savannah, salvaged that same set of ironwork made in Philadelphia, which had been an exterior balcony railing on the Wetter House. And so I went over to Chippewa Square, where it supposedly was used as a fence. Didn't find it in the square, but I noticed across the square, there it was. And there were our extra Tennessee faces. So the point of the story is Tennessee was so important. We didn't just have 2 faces in that railing. We had 6, and everybody in America got to see those Tennesseans when they bought that ironwork. Go to the next one. This is replacing the carpeting up in there. And we had these same pattern carpets made in the 1980s, but they were deteriorating from wear and tear and usage. And they were going to dispose of them. So I asked the architects if, rather than disposing of them, they would let me find a second purpose for them. So several rooms in Belmont Mansion, in Oaklands, and in Rosemont now have repurposed that carpeting. And they're also repurposing the damask drapes that otherwise would have been in a landfill. Go to the next one. This is more of the balcony up in the library chamber. Incidentally, that's Tim Walker, the director of the Metro Historical Commission over there. Let's go to the next one. And the hallways. Notice we do not have airlocks on them any longer. We have central heat and air. These are the original gas lights that are still up there in the hallway. There are only 4 original gas lights that survive in the building, and we're lucky that these massive ones are 2 of them. Let's go to the next one. This is the another go round of cleaning the Supreme Court chamber. Notice over the fireplace there is a square patch up there in the wall. That's where they had installed a potbelly cast iron stove to more adequately heat the room in the later 19th century. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is the fireplace. You can see that square there a little bit more obviously. The mantelpieces were a problem because they had destroyed them in this chamber. They had destroyed them, though, in 1969 up in the Senate chamber. And I knew of a drawing over in the Strickland portfolio for this mantelpiece. So knowing what one looked like, that's the one we copied for the restoration. And it's Hawkins County marble from East Tennessee, like the original. Let's go to the next one. This is the Governor's Suite, which was created in the 1930s in the Colonial Revival manner with Art Deco stenciling on the ceiling. Let's go to the next one. Originally, that space had been part of the state archives. The building periodically, because it has internal guttering, the water backs up and percolates down through the limestone. You can see in this slide and another one how it had damaged one of the lunettes in one of the offices, and we had to repair that and address that. All right, let's go to the next one. I want to leave room for your questions. Down in the basement, I mentioned that originally there were two large spaces down there, one for the arsenal and one for the fires that heated the building. This is the conference room that they created under the tower. And you can see we're upgrading the electricals and the mechanicals in that space back in 2012. Okay. And here they are with some of the ductwork that they're installing at that point. Okay, let's do the next one. Here they're jackhammering some of the concrete and limestone floors so they can put more computer capacity and electrical into the building. Okay. The next one. We wanted to try and open some of the groin vaulting and the ceiling space in there, but with all of the mechanicals, that was somewhat difficult, but we did find some solutions to that in one of the offices and in what had been the snack bar in the Capitol. So here we're working on that. Let's go to the next one. And here's a run through the space with some of those evenly spaced piers to support the massive weight of the building, but you can see the new ductwork going in. All right, next one. And you really don't want to look at that, so most of them are covered up. Next one. This is one of the spaces under the terraces of the Capitol. And we had not addressed the House and Senate chambers initially because the members were still smoking in them. And why waste taxpayers' money if you're putting more tar and nicotine all over everything? So when they finally banned themselves from smoking in the building, or we thought, they created a secret smoking chamber under one of the terraces. And this was it. It's now an office for some of the facilities managers' staff under the Capitol terraces. Go to the next one. Here they're channeling some of the flooring in the Governor's Suite. Next one. We had a question, is there still a tunnel for the steam heating duct? You've seen pictures in the past of people speculating, what's this tunnel? That picture was made in the 50s, so yeah, there would still be a tunnel under the hill. It's just not used on the north slope any longer. Here's some of the channeling for new electricals and computer cabling and electrical work. These are in the old committee rooms under the House Visitors Gallery. Okay. Now, remember I mentioned that on the north and south runs of 4 offices. Each of the ones on the end had a fireplace. Here's the profile of one of the fireplaces that had been walled up in the 1950s, and I photo documented it here. I think in the next slide as well, so you can see its profile more clearly. Yes, and some of the original stonework there, but they're walled up again because they needed the wall space for office desks and things in there. Let's go to the next one. This is some of the original limestone floor in the Governor's Suite of offices, and it's still in fairly good shape, but it has carpeting on it now, which is a lot easier to walk on. Go to the next one. And this is the original ceiling in the Senate Speaker's office. You can see it's flat. It has these beams running through it. The House Speaker's office has a groin vaulted ceiling. And one of our former Senate speakers had sort of ceiling envy, I guess, and asked if we could put one in there. Well, obviously, we had to sort of trompe fake it or trick the eye, fake it. So we covered this up. Let's go to the next one. There's a detail of the original ceiling and the next one. And okay, we also had to deal with some leaks in the ceilings on that floor in the hall and in the legislative body chambers. Let's go to the next one, another leak, I believe. No, this is a wall we uncovered in the governor's office. We didn't know there was actually a stone wall in there, but the archives evidently originally had separate spaces in it with stone walls, which is good to know. Let's go to the next one. That's one of the drainage channels. When Strickland was designing the building, there was that internal guttering I mentioned, which ran down through the walls, not a good thing in limestone, and then collected in these troughs to go into cisterns. The troughs are still under the terraces. When they were renovating the building, I crawled around in there and got some shots of it. Here's one, and then the next one is a longer run of it. This is going around a corner. You can see how they run the whole length of the building. Go to the next one. And some of those are really filled with debris now, but it's not a working space in the building, obviously. And the next one. This shows where the dressed stone or carved stone is there at the top, how they cut down directly into the live limestone to create a deeper floor level. Someone was asking just then about the cisterns. The cisterns have been removed, but that would have been drinking water for the building. Go to the next one. And this is a wonderful piece. This is Trompe painting where there had been a hallway and then a staircase connecting the executive floor to the balcony in the library. Well, when they moved the privies from under the north or from under the west steps into the building finally, they put the men's room in this location. So right above the two commodes, there is a drop ceiling, and this is what is above that drop ceiling now. Let's go to the next one. As the staircase went up, of course, it went to the level where the balcony is now. And this is the original 1850s decoration for that ceiling, where the mechanical room is now for the elevators in the Capitol building. Let's go to the next one. This is the ceiling in the House Speaker's office. It had been determined that the dark green was sort of dark, and they wanted to brighten it up. Well, once they started painting, they found out why it was so dark. Let's go to the next image. Remember, all of this is done in the 1930s. They were finding swastikas and stars on the ceiling, which before Hitler adopted that was pretty much generically around the world seen as a more or less good luck symbol, but no longer is. So multiple layers of white paint have now concealed that, but the dark paint was put on initially to hide that and did a good job. But when it was changed out to a lighter, it was showing through. In our terms, that pentimento, it's there and it's going to show you. Let's go to the next one. It's a clearer one where you can see the swastika at the bottom and then the star at the top. Okay, next one. This is what it looks like now, a lot more acceptable. Okay, next. This is the governor's ceiling, this is the Senate Speaker's ceiling, and where we're faking in the groin vaulting. The next one, I believe, is the governor's beautiful ceiling in the Art Deco style. Okay. No, again, this is showing some of the basement, and we're being able to expose some of those groin vaults. Next one. Yeah, this is where you can see them in one of the office suites today, which is great. Happy we were able to do that. And the next one. This shows what had been the snack bar, and again, you can see some of that groin vaulting and some of the piers there in the corner. Okay, and the next one. And showing some of the, hopefully, something that can be addressed in the future. Those original gasliers upstairs need some work. This is one of the ladies holding up one of the gas torch burners. And the next one shows a seahorse with a putti or a little cherub riding on his back. These are in the big gasliers on the legislative floor. And the next one shows the corn stalks in the Senate gasolier. The next one shows, again, some of the Senate gasolier with the tobacco plants there at the bottom. And you can see a circle of elk heads, another native animal to the state. That's why we have an Elk River and Elk Mont over in the Smokies. The next one. These are some of the corn plants. We were just asked, how often are gasoliers cleaned? Good question. Let's go to the next picture. I noticed that, in being up around there for 45 years, I'd never known anyone to take down all the globes and clean these suckers. So part of this contract, I asked them to let me take all of the globes off and have every one of them washed. And when we put them back in, people were amazed. They said, "What did you do? Include brighter candle power in these light bulbs?" No, we just cleaned the glass. That's why it's cleaner and brighter now. Let's go to the next one. Here we're reinstalling the lamp globes. Next one. We need to leave some room for questions. Here we're putting them back in the hallways. Next one. And reinstalling them in the house chamber. Next one. And they're lowering the lights in the corners of the house chamber so we can put the globes back on. Next one. This is finally the one I was anticipating. This is the Art Deco ceiling in the governor's office. It's one of my favorite ceilings up there. It's gorgeous. Look at all of that Art Deco imposed on the Greek groin vaults and the leaves up there. Next one. And the Senate gasolier going back up. Next one. And the hall ones finally, they've got their globes and they're getting ready to be lifted back into place. Next one. The mechanical, yes, someone was asking, are all of these lights on mechanical lifts? Thank goodness they are, because that would be one heck of a tall ladder otherwise. And to finish it off, we were able to reinstall all of the artwork back at the Capitol and the furnishings and the people. But let's go to the next one. The Tennessee State Museum has sponsored for over 25 years the Tennessee Waltz up there, and everybody enjoys a good party, including Governor and Mrs. Dunn. And here are Winfield and Betty at one of our waltzes a few years ago, posing for me for a picture. Thank you. Anybody have any questions now? Oh, one other thing. The Secretary of State's office has just released this book. It's a coffee table book on the history of the Tennessee State Capitol. And through the Secretary of State's website, you can find out how to order these. Beautiful book.
All right, Jim, man, that was great. I mean, I feel like we got a forensic analysis of the entire building there. And I mean, that's a behind the scenes tour like you'll never get when you visit the Capitol.
We just had a question about the labor force on the Capitol. I'm sorry I missed out on that one. Initially, there were professional stone carvers who had worked on the North Carolina Capitol that came to Tennessee to work on it. One of them was a man named John Kane, who became ill and died, not through any accident in the building of the building, but his fellow stone carvers took up a collection and got Strickland to design a tombstone with the stone carver's workbench on the top with his tools symbolically laid down for the last time, and that also is out at City Cemetery. The key component with the building of the Capitol was to keep the cost down. They hired slave labor from the slaves' owners, and they used convict labor to quarry the stone out near the Tennessee Penitentiary, which was on Church Street, just a little north of where the interstate cuts through town today. And they dragged those stones from the quarry over to the penitentiary where the convicts and the slaves carved it down, and then they had to drag it down to the Capitol and erect it down there. And our historical commission marker acknowledges the slave and convict labor that went into building our state capitol. Any other questions, Jeff?
Yeah, what gives the Capitol its National Historic Landmark status, Jim? Is that an overall thing, or is there a specific thing that grants it that? What is this? What's the process on that?
Well, Strickland was one of the leading architects in his day, the forerunner of the present AIA, American Institute of Architects. He was elected the first president of that group, and it's the best thing he ever built. Like Christopher Wren, who wanted to be buried in St. Paul's because it was the best thing he did, Strickland is buried in our Capitol. The building chairman, Samuel Morgan, is buried in our Capitol. And to me, though, the main significance of our Capitol is the expansion of the voting right. Originally, you had to be a property owner to be able to cast a ballot in America. And by the time Andrew Jackson ran for that office, the common man could vote. So Jackson became the first person the common man voted for. The next expansion we had a role in. It was giving African American males the right to vote. We ratified the 14th Amendment in the House chamber, where they had voted to leave the United States a few years before that and secede from the Union. Also in 1920, and the museum is getting ready to do a great exhibit on women's suffrage, and we are the decisive state on that. We made the perfect 36 and gave women the vote in 1920, and I hope you all can come down when the museum opens and see that exhibit.
Another one, Jim. As you know, the Capitol has been in the news lately with the protests that have happened there and around it. As I know, you've been involved with the Carmack statue. Could you give a little bit of context on who Edward Ward Carmack was?
Well, he was a newspaper man who was mentored by Duncan Cooper in his youth. Duncan helped Carmack learn the newspaper trade. Carmack went on to edit the newspaper himself then out in Memphis, where Ida B. Wells was working as an employee on an African American newspaper out there. Some African Americans decided to open a grocery store in a neighborhood that was African American, where some white Memphians had a grocery store. Well, guess where the African Americans shopped? It wasn't the white store any longer. So those grocers had the African Americans declared a public nuisance. They were arrested and taken down to the Shelby County Jail. A mob formed, pulled them out, and lynched them. Carmack was an advocate for lynching, and Ida B. Wells was incensed by all of this. She did some newspaper articles about how that was not a good solution for contemporary life. And Carmack then incited a mob by saying, "Get the black wench." And the newspaper she worked at was burned to the ground, and she never came back to Chicago. He then was named by the Tennessee General Assembly to be a United States Senator for Tennessee up in Congress. And when he wasn't reappointed by the legislature to that point, because the people didn't vote for U.S. senators then, legislatures did. His friend in Nashville, Luke Lee, asked him if he would like to come back to Nashville and edit his morning paper, the Tennessean, which was a rival to Carmack's old mentor, Duncan Cooper's Daily American. So he did. He came back. But Cooper was a good friend of Governor Malcolm Patterson. Governor Malcolm Patterson's family had been on the outs now for 2 generations with the Carmack family. So Carmack, when he came back and was editing the Tennessee and started editorializing against the governor and then getting more and more personal in his attacks on Cooper. Cooper got madder and madder, and Governor Patterson heard that Cooper was down in the men's quarter on Cherry Street, 4th Avenue at the Utopia Hotel having lunch, and that he was looking for Carmack and looking for a gun. So he asked Robin Cooper, if this is true, go find your dad, get him off the street. If he's armed, disarm him, get him home. So he found his papa. He took him up Union Street. They were looking at the hole they were digging for the new Hermitage Hotel. And then they got up to the top of the hill. This was essentially a residential neighborhood. There was a lady talking to Carmack over there in front of a house. Carmack saw the Coopers coming up the hill. They started having hot words with each other. Carmack grabbed the lady and hid behind her. Then he hid behind a telephone pole. He pulled out a revolver and shot at Robin Cooper. One bullet went through his sleeve, one went into Robin Cooper. Robin then pulled out a gun and shot and killed Carmack. Father and son were indicted on first-degree premeditated murder charges. The father was not convicted. He didn't pull out a gun or shoot at anyone. The son was convicted. They appealed it to the state Supreme Court. The court upheld the conviction, but the governor overturned that, saying, he shot at you. He tried to kill you. You shot back in justifiable self-defense. Go home, here's a pardon. Within a year, Robin was murdered, and no one has ever been accused of that crime. In 1927, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had declared Carmack a Christian saint on the cross of prohibition, they came down to the legislature that year in 1908 and got the legislature to vote to make Tennessee dry from Mountain City in the northeast, Memphis in the southwest. Didn't work out so well. When they asked Boss Hillary Howes of Nashville, are you going to close down those places on Cherry Street? He said, close them, I use them. And the same thing from Boss Crump out in Memphis. So it took the Volstead Act in 1919 to change the United States Constitution, make it illegal all over the country to manufacture, sell, or use intoxicants. Well, that's how we got the mafia. They started selling it. That's how the Kennedys became millionaires. They started illegally importing it from Canada and selling it. So we get a nice Southern Gothic twist about 1968-69. One of the Southern Middle Tennessee senators decides he's tired of climbing up all those hills around where they, in 1927, put up the Carmack statue by the WCTU. And let's do a tunnel under the hill, and then we can just ride an elevator to work. Great idea. They did it. They named it the Motlow Tunnel in his honor. So the Motlows owned Jack Daniel's distillery. So now we have a prohibitionist martyr undermined by a whiskey baron at the entrance to our capital.
Yeah, that's one of those things that's just too odd to not be true, I guess. Well, thank you for giving some context to that statue, and thank you for the work that you do. I think that's where we're going to have to leave it today, Jim. I mean, I know all of us could sit here and listen for the next 2 or 3 hours, but our lunch hour, alas, is over. So I want to say thank you again, not just for this program, but for all that you've done for the Capitol building and for Tennessee history. I know we've got a couple more digital programs to do with you, so this is not officially goodbye at this point. So for all of you folks wanting more Jim Hoobler, just keep in touch with us through social media and visit our website, and we'll have more digital programming for him from him. Next up, thank you again, Jim. Next up, folks, we have Dan Pomeroy, our Director of Collections, will be joining us. So that will really be a great program too. We're just coming with the big names, and he will be talking to us about Old Glory, William Driver's famous flag, in which the nickname for our United States flag is named is the Tennessee story. So we'll be learning more about that from Dan Pomeroy next week. So do not miss it. I guess that's where we're going to leave it today. Thank you again for joining us. I want to say thank you to everyone at the State Museum for your help in getting this this program off and running every day or every week. Again, thank you for coming. We'll see you right back here next Wednesday at noon. Thanks, everybody. Have a great week.